And I'll pass it over to Andriana for introductions.
Thank you, Julianne. Good morning, everyone. I am really excited to welcome our speaker for today, Julia Shapiro. She's our second undergraduate speaker. So I'm really excited to hear about the work she's been doing. A bit about her. Julia comes from Boca Raton. In April, she received her BA degree from UF in political science and history, and now works as a digital strategist with Break Something, a political communications agency. So thank you so much for being here, Julia, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much. So my research is titled Nazi Conspirator, Russian Patriot, Judging General Andrei Vlasov. So I'll get into it in a little bit, but my questions when I began this research project were, who is General Vlasov? Why is he so controversial today? And what can these recently released KGB documents reveal about his life and legacy and about this period of history, the World War II era? And what does the controversy about him say about Russian politics and identity in the modern world? Vlasov was an up-and-coming Red Army commander. He began his career in the military during the Russian Revolution. He was highly prestigious and influential, and he knew Stalin personally. He managed to survive Stalin's purges of 1938 to 39, during which Stalin purged many of his most talented military commanders, which would ultimately come back to bite him in just a few years. During this time, Vlasov was on a military commission in China. And during the early days of World War II, he returned to Russia, where he was promoted to lieutenant general. He defended Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev during the sieges there, and he led the Second Shock Army, which in June 1942, during the encirclement of Kiev, Vlasov requested reinforcements, which never arrived due to some sort of bureaucratic error in Moscow, and his entire army was destroyed. At this point, Vlasov was lost in German-occupied territory in Western Russia. Stalin offered a rescue plane to try and rescue somebody who would be obviously a very important asset for the Soviet government, and Vlasov refused the rescue. Both men had unclear motives, but it appears that Vlasov suspected that Stalin would potentially execute him for his military failure, which really had not been his fault, but that was something that Stalin did very frequently. And in July 1942, Vlasov was actually captured by the Germans. There, he was brought to a Berlin prisoner of war camp where he enjoyed a high status treatment as a general. They had certain privileges for high-ranking military officials. And during his interrogations, he was offered gifts. He was flattered and told about his brilliance and his prestige. And this sort of influenced him to shift his loyalties towards the Germans. And he defected in late 1942. When he defected, he denounced Bolshevism, which sort of severed any ties between him and the Soviet government. So Vlasov was a critical propaganda tool between 1942 and 1945. He was necessary to manage the Eastern policy, which was the regime that was managing the Eastern occupied territories of the Soviet Union. There was a lot of dissent there, and there was a lot of violence there. And so the Germans were struggling to find ways to suppress the population and make it into the German colony that they saw it as. There was some debate among Nazi leaders whether Vlasov was a useful idiot or a political visionary. And in fact, some of them hated him for racial reasons because Vlasov was Slavic. But during this time, he traveled across the occupied Soviet Union, recruiting defectors, going to small towns and denouncing Bolshevism to young men there and hoping to attract more defectors to his side. This was framed as a military endeavor, but there was no military. This was solely a propaganda tool. And he had ultimately no power besides in the media. So Vlasov was framed as the potential leader for a new democratic Russia in the occasion of a German victory, but his ideology was unclear. And so when he would make these speeches to Soviet citizens, they never actually explained what is a new Russia under Vlasov would look like. And so we don't really know exactly what he wanted either. Here are some images of him with leading Nazis and making a speech at a Nazi podium. So the Russian Liberation Army was the final stage of the Action Vlasov plan. This was the point where these men that he had recruited finally became sort of a military entity as opposed to solely a propaganda entity. And it was comprised of 10,000 Soviet defectors. And until 1945, it had been a propaganda tool. And in 1945, around February, they began active combat. This was at the point where the German government had depleted most of its military resources and were sending younger and younger boys into battle. So they finally called upon Vlasov and his trained army to go and fight on their behalf. And during the Czech uprising in spring of 1945, Vlasov decided to switch sides again. And he tried to cross over to the Red Army. They refused and demanded his surrender. So he began to fight alongside the Czech insurgents during that entire battle and then attempted to escape at the end of the battle. He was captured by Russian agents while escaping Prague, where he was arrested, tried, and executed by the Soviet government in 1946. And he was, in fact, one of the last Soviet citizens to be hanged. And here he is at his trial with a couple of other people who were considered traitors to the Soviet state. So this brings me to where my research began. In 2015, the Russian State Archives released the Vlasov case, History of a Betrayal, and this was translated to English in 2020. It includes hundreds of top secret KGB and Nazi documents that had previously been unreleased to the public. And there's a foreword and a conclusion written by a voice for the Russian government that frames Vlasov as a traitor. The report was published to shut down controversy as more historians had been interested in studying this case. And the Russian government was concerned about what they saw as too much sympathy for Vlasov. But in reading the report, you'll find that there's ultimately more questions than answers. And there are a few reasons for this. It's unclear, was Vlasov a Nazi sympathizer? Was he an opportunist? Was he playing everybody like a fiddle, or was he delusional? And it's complicated. So here is why I think it is so difficult to determine his true motivations. One is the gaps in the academic research on Vlasov after the war. There's a problem with framing. So it's highly entangled with changing political culture in the post-war era. The main book on this topic was written in the 1950s, and books that were written later in the 1980s have stark differences in terms of how they speak about the Soviet Union, how they speak about Stalin, just because of the increasing amount of information that was available to authors at the time. Cold War geopolitics also played an important role. So many of the people who were firsthand sources on the Vlasov story were defectors from either the Nazi regime or the Soviet state, and they wanted to distance themselves from those ideologies. And so when they would speak about these things to Western researchers or Western governments, they would downplay their own culpability and try to frame Vlasov as better or more moral than he perhaps was in reality, in order to earn the favor of Western governments and perhaps be granted asylum there. There was academic funding and career advancement to consider for scholars. So there isn't much among Western scholars on this topic because they had to consider the fact that perhaps they would not be given a lot of academic funding when they were talking in a more positive way about somebody who was seen as either a Nazi or a Bolshevik. And this would also limit their potential for career advancement. And McCarthyism as well played a role in this, because if you wrote something that was seen as too sympathetic towards Vlasov, that could not only destroy your career, but your life as well. And the third problem was unreliable or inaccessible sources. The Soviet archives were closed up until very, very recently, 2015. And the information that did come from the Soviet government was very poor quality and nobody trusted it. Like I mentioned, the firsthand sources, the people who knew Vlasov in life, were always trying to downplay their own culpability in violence and frame themselves as more noble. And also because there was no representation of the Soviet perspective, we did not have KGB documents until very recently. This overemphasized the German perspective. So reports and books that were written on Vlasov before 2015 have a strong emphasis on interpretations and ideas put forth by the Germans, as opposed to a balanced approach. And the final reason I think that it's so hard to determine what Vlasov's motivations were or who he really was is because he himself made this so. So he was very concerned with his image and his public perception, being a public figure before his capture, and he was very concerned with his historical legacy. The realities of life under totalitarianism also played a role. Vlasov was a seasoned military leader during one of the most intense periods of Stalinist Russia, and he expected to be under surveillance at all times. His language, when we have recordings of his speech, is always very carefully chosen. It's evasive, and it seems almost designed for an audience to be reading, because he knew that everything he said would be written down and recorded in a report. And ultimately, he was still a prisoner. So during any speeches that he made, anything that he said between 1942 and 1945, he was a prisoner of the German government. And so those things, he still had to say things that would please them or frame him in a positive way for them, because ultimately his life depended on their goodwill. He has a lot of intentionally contradictory opinions, and there's a lot of doubt about his real beliefs. Like I mentioned earlier, he sort of denounced Bolshevism, but often some of the Nazi officials would note that he didn't really seem to be against Bolshevism, or seemed to be sort of pretending to be against Bolshevism at times, that he was still deeply ingrained in communist ideology and perhaps only hated Stalin. So that is unclear as well. And reading between the lines of the report can help a lot with finding some answers. So I don't think that the report offers any clear answers. It doesn't conclude any of the questions that have been out there about Vlasov for the last 7 decades. It doesn't provide any clear, concrete answers, but I think there are some clues. So first, Vlasov knew that high-ranking Soviet prisoners who refused to collaborate with the Germans would not face punishment. So he knew people personally and professionally while he was in captivity who were from the Soviet military, were captured by the Germans and did not collaborate, who still existed in relatively safe conditions, who were still treated as high-ranking prisoners. Stalin frequently executed generals for military failures, which was the fate that Vlasov was facing just before his capture. And in 1942, Germany was badly beating the USSR. Conditions for Soviet citizens were dire. Many citizens in cities that were under siege by the Germans were starving. Things were extremely, extremely difficult for citizens there. And so perhaps this influenced his choice as well. Germany promised and actually delivered material security and comfort for their high-ranking prisoners, of which Vlasov was one. And ultimately that came true. They did provide him a home in Berlin, food. He was probably safer and more comfortable than he would have been, even if he had gone back to the Soviet Union and Stalin had not executed him. And in 1945, when it was clear that Germans were losing the war, Vlasov switched back to the Soviet side. So I think this gives us a lot of clues as to his motivations. It's a combination of the following: earning the favor of Nazi officials to maintain his career station and his well-being in Germany, strengthening his position and support as the potential future leader of Russia under an undefined ideology, maintaining plausible ideological distance from Nazism should they lose the war, to leverage himself as an ally for Western governments, somebody who could be seen as an expert on both the Soviet government and the Nazi government would be an extremely important asset for Western governments in a post-war world. And he also wanted to foster a favorable historical legacy, and that is clear through a lot of his quotes. He talks about feeling responsible for the fate of millions of Russians, feeling that he was destined to lead them out of this crisis. And I think this also brings up some interesting questions about the study of history in this period in particular. Should historians be judges of morality, and how do we assess morality under conditions of totalitarianism and war? Past historians put Vlasov into one of two categories: that was anti-communist freedom fighter or amoral Nazi collaborator. And in the post-Cold War era, they favored a more nuanced empirical approach. So Mark Edelay's book, Stalin's Defectors, is a systematic study of a lot of Soviet defectors from this time, and it investigates all of the complex reasons that individual people defected, all of the larger societal reasons that so many Soviet citizens ultimately defected to the Germans, because it was quite a high proportion. But it investigates it as a widespread, complex psychosocial phenomenon, and it explores the logic of collaboration without condoning the violence and terror inflicted on the victims of the Germans. And Vlasov remains very relevant in Russia today. When the Soviet Union fell, interest in the case grew among right-wing civic groups, historians, and nationalists. And during the same period, this was when Vladimir Putin began consolidating his power and rebuilding Russian nationalism outside of the Soviet state in his image. He references World War II very, very often, and memorials for it are high-profile displays of nationalism. The Victory Day Parade in Moscow, which I'm sure many of us have seen images of, is one of the most important patriotic holidays in Russia today. And Putin's government has strongly rejected calls to rehabilitate Vlasov or to portray him sympathetically. Some historians have been denied PhDs for this, and there's been quite a lot of political controversy and free speech controversy over the government's hard approach to Vlasov sympathy. He is unequivocally seen as a traitor who should not be glorified. Vlasov's case also undermines the idealized view of World War II that's a core component of Russian national identity. In Russia, they refer to the World War II as the Great Patriotic War. It's a very important core piece of the modern Russian identity outside of communism, outside of the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's something that bonds many Russians together today, and it's a core myth element of the Russian identity. Vlasov goes against this. He reveals the dangerous, morally ambiguous reality of life and war under totalitarianism, and what it was like to make decisions under these complex circumstances that we simply can't replicate today. He has some implications for the study of history as well. His story challenges the traditional historical approach to World War II and Nazi collaboration, which is generally a very black and white Nazi, non-Nazi approach. Collaboration studies generally focused on Western Europe for the most part. So that focused on people who collaborated with the Nazis in France and Belgium. And those people have a much more clear motivation, an ideological motivation, than people in the Soviet Union, because like I mentioned, the conditions in the Soviet Union were so horrific. This ignores the unique conditions that led millions of Soviet citizens to collaborate with their enemy. The controversy over Vlasov's case also reveals some gaps in historians' ability to understand decision-making processes under so many different types of pressure. It highlights the problem of dividing historical figures into moral categories because we simply cannot remove our hindsight bias. I think many World War II studies will unknowingly include quite a bit of hindsight bias, because today we know what we know about World War II, and the people at the time did not necessarily know these things. I think the people who collaborated had a lot of different levels of knowledge about what was truly going on, or the reality of the Nazi ideology. But I think it's important to investigate that on an individual level and to understand the incentive structures that led people to make those choices. And he also has some relevance in politics today. So teaching, preserving, and learning from history are increasingly politicized endeavors in societies like Russia, Germany, and the United States, which is increasingly a problem here. More information access on the internet means that we're grappling with uncomfortable historical truths. These things are coming to light, even if they had not been taught in textbooks in schools. We now have access to the information, and so we're trying to make sense of a lot of things that we find to be very difficult or uncomfortable. And we have to choose between these comforting patriotic myths or the less noble true story. I think a good comparison to this is in the United States, the reality that our founding fathers owned slaves. Many of them owned slaves. And we can either choose that to believe that they were freedom fighters, that they wanted equality for all people, or we can try to grapple with the reality that they did own slaves. They were hypocritical, but at the same time, they created a system of government that was entirely new, that did implement a new level of freedom in the world. And that's a difficult process to deal with. So often some people who consider themselves very patriotic will view the process, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this word, but it's a German word that means coming to terms with the past. It was coined after World War II for Germans to sort of come to terms with what had been done in their name. They view this process as an affront to national pride and an attempt to delegitimize key values and ideas. So, for example, the founding fathers owning slaves does not take away from the idea that this was a newly free country. It was a radical free experiment in democracy, but we simply have to learn how to accept both of those truths at once. The conflict is the reason that Vlasov is viewed as such a threatening figure for governments nearly 8 decades after his death, because he elicits profound moral dilemmas and reveals the catastrophic reality of war, of which Putin is now familiar with too. And such nuances are at odds with the black and white logic that underpin authoritarianism in Russia and increasingly around the world. That's the end.
Thank you, Julia. Are there any questions from our Okamic audience or online? Hi, Izzy. Go ahead if you'd like to unmute.
Do you think that he was looking to be on the side that won? If the Germans won, they might have made him the head of the head of the USSR. And if he was with the Russians won, they might have made him the head of the occupied Germany or something.
I think so. I think he wanted to be on the side that won. I think because he, like I mentioned, he defected in 1942 at the height of the Germans' power in the war. I think he thought that they were going to win. And so he sort of burned that bridge once he defected. I don't think that the Soviet government ever would have made him a leader again, but I think he was hoping that they wouldn't kill him should the Germans lose. But he made a gamble. He made the wrong gamble. But I think he did believe that he was trying to curry favor with either side. Yes.
Okay, I don't see any other questions here, but we sure appreciate your time and your studies, and we wish you the best as you continue.
I think there's another question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I don't see it.
Oh, it's to me
Walter,
in
did you
direct
have a
message.
question?
It's in the chat.
All right, Adriana, any final comments?
Oh, Julia, did you want to address that question, or was that just you're muted?
I'm getting a question in the chat from direct message. So
Gotcha.
I'll see what the
Gotcha. Walter, did you have any questions?
I just wanted to thank you, Adriana, and again, tell everyone that we'll start again next year. And we recruited a speaker from a little while ago, and she's going to take over. I appreciate the 3 years that Andrea's done for us, and I look forward to several more years with our new recruiter, Abigail, who is a rising senior. So we should have her for a few years, and I think she'll do a good job. Thank all of you for coming. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much for being here today, Julia. I really appreciate it.
I think Phyllis has a question that I can just answer quickly before we log off.
Yeah, of course.
So she says, it seems that historians aren't taking into account the fact that the general was part of Russian culture, very different values than Western Europeans. I think that's possible. A lot of the historians who wrote about him were Russians, or like the children of Russian dissidents or people who had fled Russia. And so that sort of like, they already had a more positive view of him. But yes, I do think that's true. And I think the historians often don't take into account how difficult life was or how scary life was for Soviet citizens, as opposed to people who were living in France before the occupation. So I think that's correct.
All right, well, we thank you again for your time and we wish you the best. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, Julie.